Jai Hind दोस्तों. In my previous videos, I have talked about Aristotle's concept of tragedy, his concept of plot, and also discussed various elements of tragedy. In this video, I am going to talk about Aristotle's concept of imitation or mimesis. We also call it his theory of imitation. Before we try to understand Aristotle's concept of imitation, we need to understand Plato's concept of imitation or mimesis or representation, because Aristotle's concept of imitation or mimesis is a kind of reaction against Plato's concept of imitation. So let us try to understand, figure out Plato's concept of mimesis or imitation. Plato's theory of mimesis or imitation is central to the philosophy of art and literature. In his work, The Republic, Plato expresses concerns about the effect that art, especially poetry and drama, can have on individuals and society. His theory can be summarized in a few key points. Point number 1, imitation and reality. Plato argued that imitation and reality. Plato argues that all artistic imitation is a mere imitation of reality. It is just an imitation of reality. Artists create copies of the physical world. It's a copy of physical world, which itself is an imperfect, reflection of the ideal forms. So it is a kind of imitation of the idea. And what is original thing? The original thing is an idea, and that too in the mind of God. Plato says that God created this universe according to his idea in his mind. The artist who tried to represent this world is a kind of copy of that idea that is there in the mind of God himself. So it's not a kind of perfect imitation or representation of the physical world that we see around us. Second point, distrust of art. So in the first point, Aristotle tried to distinguish between what is real and what is unreal. So imitation is a copy of the world outside, which itself is imperfect, because this world is created according to the idea in the mind of God. So idea in the mind of God is original thing. Plato attaches great importance to the moral value of art. He considers that every art should create a kind of moral lesson. Every art should convey. Every art should impart a kind of moral lesson to the people, to the students. So art should not be the copy. It should be real thing. And therefore he says that the art that claims to represent the real world is just a copy of the so-called real world. So that is not the real world, because the real thing is an idea in the mind of God. So he is very skeptical about it. Plato is very skeptical about art. Plato was skeptical about art because he thinks that art does not give moral lesson. It does not convey moral lesson. It does not impart moral lesson. So it has no moral and educational value. Art does not have moral and educational value. He believed that art often appeals to the emotion and senses rather than to the reason and intellect. Try to understand why he is not giving more importance to Art, because according to him, art appeals to emotions and senses. He said that the art should appeal to the reason and intellect, potentially leading individuals away from truth and virtue. Since art appeals to emotion and senses, it takes people away from truth and virtue. Plato proposed strict censorship of art in his ideal state, because he wanted to have a kind of ideal state where there is no place for immorality, where there is no place for cowardice, where there is no place for emotions, instincts. It should appeal to only reason and logic. And therefore, Plato says that there should be strict censorship of art. He believed that only art that promoted virtues, and so he said that only art that promoted virtues and upheld the ideals of the state should be allowed. So he said that there should be art that represents, the art must represent heroic deeds. The art must impart moral values. Art that imitates values. Only such art should be allowed. Only this kind of art, especially poetry, should be allowed to be taught in the class. He is giving importance to morality. He is giving importance to virtues. So try to understand, he does not completely denying teaching of art in the classrooms. He said that the arts that uphold moral values and virtues should be allowed to teach. So if the art is about, if the poetry is about, if the literature is about God, literature is about virtues, if literature is about heroic deeds that inspire the people, such art must be allowed to be taught in the classroom. He is very, very clear about it. He firmly believes that art does not represent reality. So he said that all the poets in particular are liars, Liars. All the poets in particular are liars, and poetry is the mother of lies. And therefore, such poetry should not be allowed to be taught in the classroom, because it does not give good lesson to the students in particular. Philosophical alternative. Plato advocated for a focus on philosophical alternative. What is that? He says that philosophy as the pursuit of ultimate truth and virtue. He says that the function of philosophy is to find out the truth and virtue, and therefore he said that philosophy must be allowed. Philosophical contemplation, according to Plato, would lead individuals to higher understanding of reality, because the whole focus of philosophy is to go deeper and deeper and deeper and finding out truth. And therefore he said that philosophy must be taught, or philosophical contemplation should be allowed. Plato's views of mimesis had a profound influence on later Western philosophy and aesthetics, shaping debates about the purpose and value of art for centuries. So he made a great impact on Aristotle. So try to understand their relationship also, and how they argue on the same kind of concept, that is imitation or mimesis. So Plato ideas become a kind of foundation for Aristotle, and Aristotle developed his theory from Plato's ideas of imitation, but he does not completely agree with Plato. Now let us come down to Aristotle's concept of imitation. We have seen Plato does not have regard. Plato does not have regard for arts and artists. He has a very low opinion about them. He has a very low opinion about them. Aristotle is arguing against Plato's idea of imitation. There are certain points that we need to understand. How Aristotle defines mimesis or representation or imitation. Aristotle defined mimesis as the representation or imitation of reality. It is representation of reality, encompassing not just visual arts but also literature, music, and drama. Unlike Plato, not like Plato, who viewed imitation as a mere copy of an imperfect world. Why imperfect world? Because the whole world is a copy of an idea in the mind of God. So original thing is idea in the mind of God, and this world is a kind of imperfect copy of that idea. Aristotle saw it as a creative process. Try to understand. Aristotle does not condemn art and artist. Rather, Aristotle look upon the process of imitation as a creative process that could reveal universal truth. So it is philosophical. Whatever is expressed in art and literature is a kind of philosophical truth, and it gives us a kind of insight about human nature. This we need to understand. Aristotle does not condemn imitation. Rather, he says imitation is a kind of creative process and it gives us a kind of insight into human nature. So this is a very big claim that Aristotle makes. Then what is the purpose of art? Aristotle believed that art through imitation serves a cathartic function. Catharsis I have already explained. Aristotle believed that art through mimesis serves a cathartic function for both the artist and the audience. By imitating emotions and experiences, art allows people to understand and process their own emotion, leading to a purification of these emotions. Aristotle makes comparison between epic poetry and tragedy as far as imitation is concerned, as far as mimesis is concerned or representation is concerned. Epic and tragedy imitate actions. Epic and tragedy imitate actions through narrative and dramatic representation. So tragedy imitates action through dramatic representation, while epic imitates action through narrative, and both evoking emotions like pity and fear that leads to catharsis. Catharsis, I said that I have already explained, but still I make a passing reference to it. So it is, as we know, a very important concept as far as tragedy is concerned. In poetics, Aristotle defined the concept of catharsis. According to him, catharsis refers to the emotional cleansing or purification that the audience experiences as a result of watching a tragedy. Aristotle believed that the key purpose of tragedy is to evoke and then purge emotions of pity and fear in the audience. By experiencing these intense emotions through the characters on the stage, as far as tragedy is concerned, the audience undergoes a form of emotional release or purification. This process, this process of purification or cleansing, this process of purification or cleansing helps individuals to achieve a state of emotional balance and clarity. Through the events and character depicted in tragedy, the audience gains insight into human nature, moral dilemmas, and the consequences of actions. This deeper understanding can lead to a sense of moral and psychological clarity. Catharsis is not just about feeling pity and fear, it also involves a complex interplay of various emotions. As the audience emphasizes with the characters' struggles, they engage with their own emotional and moral reflections. This process can lead to a very subtle understanding of human conditions. Aristotle considered catharsis to have an educational aspect. By confronting and resolving the intense emotions aroused by a tragic narrative, the audience learns about the nature of these emotions and how to deal with them in real life. This emotional education, this emotional education is important aspect of the cathartic process. As I said, lyric poetry and comedy imitate emotions and character aiming to entertain or evoke laughter rather than evoke serious emotional responses, as does tragedy. Aristotle argued that art should not merely imitate reality but should also embody artistic principles like unity, coherence, and completeness. He placed importance on the formal qualities of art and the skill of the artist in achieving these qualities. Unlike Plato's distrust of art, Plato does not believe in art. He is very skeptical about the function of art. Aristotle believed that art could play a positive role in education and moral development. He doesn't say that art corrupts mind of the people, art corrupts mind of the students, but he says that art can play a very positive role in education and moral development. He saw art as a means to teach. He saw art as means to teach virtues and ethical principles by presenting exemplary characters and actions. Overall, Aristotle's theory of imitation provides a foundation for understanding the aesthetics of art and its psychological, moral, and educational impact, setting the stage for later development in Western philosophical thought on art and literature. We have seen that all arts imitate. So, imitation is the basic principle of all arts, but they differ in three things. What are those three things? They differ in object of imitation, medium of imitation, and mode or manner of imitation. So let us see the object of imitation. Try to understand the difference between tragedy and comedy. Aristotle says tragedy imitates serious and significant actions that evoke emotions like pity and fear in the audience. Tragedy typically focuses on noble characters, often of high social or moral standing, who undergo a downfall or reversal of fortune due to tragic flaw or a mistake in judgment. Tragic flaw or a mistake in judgment. That's a kind of error, or we say miscalculation of the situation around them. The aim of tragedy is to arouse feeling of pity and fear through the depiction of intense and profound human experiences such as suffering and moral dilemmas. Coming to comedy, Aristotle says comedy imitates everyday character. Comedy imitates everyday characters and situations, often in a humorous or satirical way. Comedy tends to focus on ordinary people. Try to understand the difference. Tragedy imitates great people, outstanding people in some way, whereas comedy tends to focus on ordinary people, societal norms, and everyday life, often exaggerating flaws, or absurdities in human behavior or social conventions. Unlike tragedy, which aims for catharsis through pity and fear, comedy seeks to provoke laughter and amusement. Comedy often uses irony, wit, and satire to condemn social norms or human follies, aiming to entertain and provide comic relief. It's not high kind of relief, just a comic relief. In summary, while both tragedy and comedy involve imitation, they do imitate. Though tragedy and comedy involve imitation, they differ significantly in their objects of imitation. Tragedy focuses on serious and noble actions that evoke pity and fear, while comedy focuses on everyday character and situation that provoke laughter and amusement. These differences reflect Aristotle's understanding of how each genre serves distinct emotional and moral purposes within the realm of art and literature. Coming to medium of imitation, as I said, all arts imitate, but they differ in object of imitation, medium of imitation, mode or manner of imitation. Each art form utilizes different mediums or materials through which the imitation takes place. For example, painting uses pigments on canvas, sculpture uses stone or metal, music uses sound waves, literature uses language, and so on. So in this way we find a kind of difference between all these art forms as far as medium of imitation is concerned. The mode of imitation refers to specific techniques and methods employed within each art form to achieve imitation. For example, in literature, this could involve narrative structure, characterization, and dialogue, description. In music, it could involve melody, harmony, rhythm, and instrumentation. Tragedy primarily imitates through dramatic action and dialogue performed by actors on the stage. Tragedy is structured around a unified plot with beginning, middle, and end. It focuses on a single action or series of closely related actions that unfold sequentially. Tragedy emphasizes the emotional and psychological development of characters, particularly their responses to significant events and their moral dilemmas. Tragedy aims to evoke emotions like pity and fear in the audience. Tragedy imitates through action that the actors enact on the stage. The action is enacted on the stage. The actors play part on the stage. So it is dramatized. Imitation is dramatized, whereas in epic poetry it is narrated. Epic poetry imitates through a narrative told in verse, often by a narrator or poet. Epic poetry imitates through a narrative told in verse, often by a narrator or poet, rather than through direct dramatic performance, as we see in tragedy. In tragedy, we saw that action is performed on the stage. The characters play their part on stage. Action is done on the stage. Plot is enacted on the stage. In epic, everything is narrated either by a narrator or a poet. Epic typically spans a larger scope of time and space, recounting heroic deeds and adventures of legendary figures or mythological heroes. It includes episodes, subplots that contribute to overall narrative. Epic emphasizes the heroic action and achievement of its protagonists, presenting them as larger than life figures. While it can evoke emotions, epic poetry often focuses more on grandeur, heroic virtue, and the cultural values of society it depicts. In summary, the mode or manner of imitation in tragedy involves dramatic performance focused on a unified plot, single plot, with intense emotional and moral conflicts among characters. In contrast, epic poetry uses narrative verse to recount heroic adventures and deeds over a broader canvas, often portraying legendary figures and emphasizing grandeur and heroic virtues rather than intense emotional engagement. These differences reflect Aristotle's distinction between the performative and narrative aspects of imitation in these two genres, that is, epic poetry and tragedy. Despite these differences, Aristotle believed that all arts share the common goal of mimesis or imitation or representation, which allows them to represent aspects of reality and evoke emotional responses from the audience. This shared principle underlies their aesthetic value and their capacity to provide insight into human experience and emotions. Thank you. Jai Hind.